welcome back to another vlog. This is Adventure Time, season episode something or other. Nobody can seem to agree. This is a commission vlog for Seth Aaron Hirschman. Thank you as always for backing my Patreon. So, first off, you may have noticed this is a slightly different environment than I usually film in, and by slightly, I mean tremendously. Short version is, I got a couch, why not use it? Long version is, you may notice there's an empty space next to me, in which might be put a screen, or another person. Basically, it gives me more options of things I can do with this filming setup. The vlogs themselves aren't going to change, it just means I can try some other things if I want to. So, come along with me. This was, for starters, just an excellent episode. I don't know that I'd call it, by any means, the best Adventure Time episode ever. That's such a hard concept to pin down because the show has such a wide tonal range. Certainly, there's a very strong case to be made that I Remember You is the best episode of the series. Certainly, it's the one with the biggest emotional punch. There's been some highly experimental episodes that are just utterly fascinating. So I don't know that it's by any means the best, but certainly it was very, very good. And I think what I want to do with it is just kind of go through some things that I wanted to talk about, more or less in the order they show up in the episode. This means that I will be looping at the end back to what I started with, which is kind of perfect, because Adventure Time has a very cyclical view of history. And we see that with the opening credits of the episode. Adventure Time with Shermie and Beth. Now, first of all, the show has kind of primed us for this idea of alternate opening sequences. I think, unless I'm much mistaken, the first one was A Glitch is a Glitch is a Glitch, which had the 3D graphics. But it was still the same sequence, just animated differently. The first really different one, I think, was Stakes, and I think that's the pattern they stuck to. That the mini-series had these alternate openings. And that's essentially what this is. I imagine when this is eventually aired in reruns, it'll be chopped up into 4 regular length episodes, and they'll all start with the Adventure Time with Shermie and Beth opening. And it'll be a mini-series, like Stakes, or Elements, or Islands. The thing those miniseries did, though, was it emphasized something that had been building in the show for years. Which, at first the show was focused very much on Finn and Jake, but as it went on, more and more it became the case that secondary characters could carry their own episodes. We get episodes that are focused on various members of the supporting cast in which Finn and Jake appear little, if at all. Because that's the strength of the characters that they've built up. And so initially that's what we're presented with, is we're presented with an episode that, like The Graybles, is set in the far future and flashing back via a storyteller to the setting of the show. The show is always set in the far future, but the far future from the perspective of the characters, the even farther future, one might say. And it is very closely akin to what we see in Grable's 1000 Plus, which appears to be the same as what we see in the ending of the episode Lemon Hope, which is a decidedly different place. It's a lot less colorful. The Candy Kingdom is nowhere to be seen. There's the Ice Thing, the flying Ice King-like creature, which the origins of do get explained in this episode, but I'll probably get to that. There's, been various glimpses of things at various points in the show of future stuff, and this is kind of putting it into a context by giving us some actual future characters to see it through. So we get what looks like a kingdom of dogs in the opening sequence, and Beth is the pup princess. So the implication, at least, is that the pups, Jake's children, founded a kingdom of their descendants. Given that they seem to have fairly sizable litters and they grow to adulthood in a matter of days, it isn't that surprising that in 1,000 years the number of pups could grow enormous. Especially given that they can crossbreed with at least bears. There's some other elements in the future that we see early on. One we saw back in Lemon Hope, which is, I call the World Tree, because that's what it looks like to me. It's this enormous tree reaching up into the clouds. To me, that very strongly suggests the recurring symbol in mythology of the axis mundi, the axis of the world, the world tree. Probably the best known example is Yggdrasil. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but from Norse mythology. But there's examples to be found in a whole bunch of different world mythologies. And it appears to be, we learn otherwise in the course of the episode, but at least at the beginning it appears to be the treehouse. And that is kind of redolent with meaning. I had first come to this conclusion back when it was first shown in, I think, Lemon Hope. At least I don't recall seeing it before that. That the treehouse becomes the world tree. It becomes the center around which the whole world revolves. It kind of always has been. Because this whole world is Finn and Jake's adventures. So, of course, their home is the center of all of that. That's kind of how adventures work. You strike out, and then you come back. And then you strike out in a different direction and come back. And that's always been how the series has gone, is they always come back to that center of the treehouse. The fact that it's not their treehouse modifies things a little, but I'll get there. And of course, there's lots of other little touches. The prize ball guardians replacing the gumball guardians, they appear to have Candy Kingdom citizens trapped inside them. I assume they were created by Princess Bubblegum to protect the Candy Kingdom citizens through some crisis or disaster. Because she's the one who made the Gumball Guardians and they seem very similar, and because that's the kind of thing she does. So presumably at some point, even farther in the future, they'll be released to live in the world again. I know there's some stuff that that some of the writers, character designers have said about this future, that the Pup Kingdom is kind of tyrannical, and Beth and Shermie are in rebellion against it, and stuff like that. Not really relevant, I don't think, to the ending of the show, but it's out there. So I thought I'd make, because otherwise I'm sure somebody would bring it up in the comments. So I just want to make clear I do know about that. So finally we get the last thing that really interested me is BMO. That BMO is, first of all, the legendary King of Ooh, which is hilarious. And said to have lived forever, which, I mean, BMO is on the order of 2,000 years old. Now that Mo is dead, BMO is up there with Marceline and Simon for oldest beings in the world. BMO is almost definitely at least a couple centuries older than Princess Bubblegum. Which is kind of amazing because BMO is such a childlike character, but that's the thing, is BMO is this eternal child, and we see that even with BMO as the King of Ooh and telling this story. It's very noticeable that right from the beginning of the story, BMO is signposted as an unreliable narrator because he can't even remember Finn's name. And so the story within a story is just that. It's being presented as a legend being looked back on, just like the Graybles were. It's being presented as something which isn't... I'm struggling a little bit for language here. It's being presented as something which diegetically is not quote-unquote real. It is, of course, exactly as real as the rest of the show, but it's framed as a distorted memory, which is an interesting thing to do with it. And closely relates, I think, to the fact that the resolution of the Gum War is presented as a dream. And that's kind of where I want to move to next, is the extended dream sequence, which certain elements of it felt very David Lynch to me. Very much like Twin Peaks references. In particular, the sort of not there one frame, there the next appearance of the toothbrushes in Bubblegum and Gumbald's hands. After they attack each other, the way they vibrate, their faces vibrate, that's very Lynch. The sound design had a lot of electric droning, buzzing noises, clicks that sounded like, electric, like the click of a old-style fluorescent light turning on and off. That's very Lynchian sound design. He really likes those kinds of kind of ominous, obnoxious electric noises. The constantly staring eyes and the use of them to transition between shots, very Lynchian. And just the fluidity of identity, the way that Bubblegum and Gumball kept switching identities when more or less Bubblegum was advancing on more or less Gumball with the serum. And I mean, nobody does Dreamlike better than David Lynch, so it's a good choice to go with him. The flip side of that is that it makes comparison inevitable, and one of the really glaring differences is there's obvious meaning to this dream, whereas Lynch's more hallucinatory sequences tend to deliberately defy reading. They tend to push toward a multiplicity of contradictory readings, whereas this had a pretty clear, straightforward reading for the Bubblegum and Gumball segments, that they were forced into each other's shoes, that Gumball was forced to feel the burden of responsibility for maintaining the maintaining the candy kingdom that Princess Bubblegum feels, and the sense of failure when that's lost. And Bubblegum was forced to feel the horror of being reduced, of being rendered into this helpless creature that can remember that it could help her, but can't express it. She remembers that she once would have been able to help, and she tries to say, I can help you, but all she can think of is to try to cheer him up with a silly dance, which is useless. Because she's been made silly, essentially. And the idea is that having experienced each other's lives as a nightmare gives them empathy and understanding for one another. It works for Bubblegum, not so much for Gumball. And I actually really like that, because some people just aren't the epiphany type, as Aunt Lolly puts it. Some people you genuinely can't reach. And to get them to stop hurting people, you have to force them. Sometimes there's just no other option. And in a way, I feel like this is a rebuke to Steven Universe. A loving one, but still recognizing that, Adventure Time is not utopian the way that Steven Universe is. It depicts... What it depicts is not a better world, just a different one. And it has its own senses of right and wrong, but things don't always work out well. And that's 100% legitimate. And it's kind of a little bit saying, things are a little too easy for Steven in terms of persuading people. But I do really like the use of the dream. I like it as well as a resolution for Finn and Fern, because they share that fault and that common experience through almost their entire lives until they diverged as a result of Prismo messing with time, plus the grass sword, plus the Finn sword. Fern's backstory is so convoluted, it's hilarious. And I think it's really important that Finn was the impetus for Fern to try to break free of his demon. Because Finn has had to fight his own demons over the course of the show. He's had to mature a lot. And so he gives Fern the impetus, but it's Fern that does it. It's Fern that smashes the demon when Finn hesitates, knowing that Fern could die as a result, and in fact he does. Interesting too, that the singing pot beast, as Finn calls it, that pops out and prevents them from killing each other right from the start. Very briefly, you can see it becomes the cosmic owl. Right at the end, right near the end of the dream, which both says that the cosmic owl directly intervened in this dream to change its outcome, which he kind of yelled at Gunther for doing before, and it's at least implied that that was part of Orgolord's scheme to get free and get into space by more or less using, the fact that cosmic owl dreams come true. Orgolord used that to cause the Candy Kingdom to turn on Bubblegum so that he could then steal her ship. I don't know why I'm relitigating seasons-old episodes. Probably just because I've never gotten to vlog this show before, and I really like it, and I've watched all of it. So that's kind of the dream. And plus Jake and Jermaine just being silly, being comic relief. It highlights something that I think is interesting, which is, at the beginning of the series, Jake really came across as the more mature of the two. He often gave Finn advice. He often, he was the one who did the cooking. He was the big brother. But as the show has progressed, Jake has remained a mostly static character, though he's had a little bit of growth forced on him by his puppies. Mostly, he's been a static character while Finn has developed and developed and developed, with the result that now Jake is the immature, silly one who provides the comic relief, while Finn drives the plot forward. And I really like that. And it gets into something in the future segments that I'll get to later. So, the war is resolved, Golb emerges, there's some fighting, some demons. The next thing that happens that I, have to talk about is Marceline and Bubblegum kiss. Which, A, hell yes, about time. B, really? Only now? Only now when the show is ending? This is why I think the earlier thing might have been a rebuke to Steven Universe, because this is clearly something made possible by Steven Universe. I remember just a few years ago when the mere suggestion that Bubblegum and Marceline might have been an item in the past resulted in that the Cartoon Network web series that made the suggestion being yanked. But the show has always played with it, clearly seeded it, and here at the end, when they can't be canceled, A, and B, with the example of the wedding in Steven Universe, they are able to do it. And that's kind of a testament to that show's impact, and indirectly to this show's impact. Because Adventure Time... So in my writing, I talk about kind of how there are shows which usher in an era. Between the two of them, DuckTales and Tiny Toons really started the modern era of animation, of television animation. But I think there's a case to be made that within that, there's an era that starts with Adventure Time, or possibly slightly earlier with Flapjack, but that's neither here nor there. Because Adventure Time launched so many careers. So many creators of some of the best cartoons of the 2010s got their start with Adventure Time. Alex Hirsch of Gravity Falls, J.G. Quinzel, regular show, Rebecca Sugar, Adventure Time, Ian Jones Quarty, not Adventure Time, Steven Universe, Ian Jones Quarty, Natasha Allegri. Like, it's a long list of young creators who came out of Adventure Time as their starting point. Or as kind of the thing that made their name, not necessarily the first thing they ever did. And that's a powerful thing for a show to do. And so the fact that then, by standing on its shoulders, Steven Universe can go to these heights, and then the fact that Steven Universe pushed a particular boundary allows Adventure Time, which had failed to push that boundary before, now it finally can do it. And it can have Bubblegum and Marceline kiss, and be heavily implied to be together in the ending. And it does make me happy. They're a good pair. You know, plus they're both possibly immortal. Bubblegum appears to think she's mortal, but she's very, very long-lived. Like, she's talked about needing an heir and what'll happen when she's gone and she won't be around forever. But she's like 800 plus years old. And Marceline is like 1,000. So yeah. I really liked that. The next thing I think I want to talk about is Time Adventure, seeing as we're talking about Rebecca Sugar. This is the song she wrote for the episode, and it's a song that really sums up a lot of Adventure Time, because it's a song about how... So a recurring theme of Adventure Time is that time is circular. Things happen over and over again in new forms. Civilizations rise and fall. Individuals recur. Finn has past lives. The elementals recur over time. Sorry, brain fart. There's just this cycle of history that happens over and over again, you know, and we see it all over the place. We see it, for example, with Betty and Simon, where Simon pulls Betty out of the the mushroom war is about to happen. He essentially rescues from that and pulls her into the future. She then dedicates herself to rescuing him from being Simon. In the process, they get caught up in two other of these recurring cycles. The Ice Crown, which turns the wearer into essentially a reincarnation of a twisted version of Evergreen. And the conflict between Magic Man and Gold, which isn't initially a cycle, but it becomes one once Betty gets involved. Betty steals Magic Man's power. She almost loses Simon to Gold, but Simon ends up losing her to Gold, just as Magic Man lost Marbles. And now Simon is seeking to rescue her at the end. And just like Magic Man, he goes to Prismo, and Prismo's like, I can't help you. Because wishes cannot defeat gold, which we saw here. The wish on the Ice Crown could not overcome gold. It could only enable Betty to merge, essentially, with gold. So the show's always had these cycles. We see that when Marceline references the last war she lived through. We see that with Princess Bubblegum. When Finn says we've been friends for a long time, she sees his past life, whose name I'm blanking on, Shoko. Things happen again and again. And the song is kind of about that, but it's about more than that. It's about the idea that time isn't just circular, it's completely illusory. Things happen over and over again because they're still happening. That our concept of time is something imposed by us. And there's this great reference in there to splitting time up into millions of pictures so they can be arranged on the wall. And that's pretty clearly a reference to animation itself and to frames. It's a great song. And it defeats Gold, in part, yes, because he's chaos and it's harmony and so on and so forth, but also because Gold is change. It's talked about as being the source of chaos, and all change is ultimately rooted in chaos. In perfect order, there is no change. Which means, for example, the Lich describes himself as a scholar of gold. He is, the Lich represents death, very clearly. And that is a form of drastic change. But the Lich arrived on the Catalyst Comet just as Finn did. Finn is just as much of an agent of change as the Lich is, as the Comet from the episode of the same name is. And that Comet offers transcendence, which is a kind of death, as Lemon Grab describes it in that episode where they go up the mountain, the really weird one. The really weird one, because there's no shortage of really weird ones. Lemon Grab refers to it as the ego death. The escaping of the limitations of the self, but it is still a kind of death. Any sufficiently drastic transformation is. All of that, if Gold is truly chaos, then all of that is rooted in Gold. And so, when they sing this song about how everything that was still is, that is directly antithetical to that. As Finn says, Finn makes the choice to stay in meat reality. He makes the choice not to go. To live on. And that brings us to Fern. Because in a sense, so does Fern. He chooses to be reborn. And it is a transformation, a drastic transformation from plant person to, literal tree. But in doing so, he becomes the world tree. He becomes the center around which the whole world rotates. And in a sense, thus, as I was talking about earlier, still is the treehouse. is immortal, in essence, as the World Tree. And that's such a powerful symbol of order, and of not changing, of living on forever. And so that's kind of where the show wants to end. I think it's very notable that by the end of the show, there are essentially 5 brothers. There's always been Finn and Jake from the start, but there's also Jermaine and BMO and Fern by the end of the series, and they are essentially, in different ways, siblings. To Finn and Jake, if not necessarily to each other. And every single one of them becomes immortal, in a different sense. Jermaine is the most esoteric of them. We see him in the final Come Along With Me, painting a new mural on Lemongrab's ceiling. And again, it was that mural that started Lemongrab off, excuse me, on his quest that he eventually rejected to, achieve ego death. So, we know from Lemon Hope that castle is still there in 1,000 years. It is entirely believable, being protected from the elements and all, that mural is still intact in 1,000 years. And that's Jermaine's immortality, is through his art. And that's an important one, I think, because that's Adventure Time's immortality as well. It's launched all these careers. It's had all this influence on all these other shows. That's the sense in which it lives on past this finale. But all of these characters become immortal in their own ways. Jake has an entire kingdom of descendants. His immortality comes through his children, as parents often feel. BMO is literally immortal, just still alive and kicking and remembering 1,000 years in the future. Fern becomes immortal by transforming into something eternal. He is the one who transcends himself and becomes the World Tree, as I said. Which, since the World Tree is all of reality, he is essentially transcending and becoming everything. He becomes the world. The exact opposite of what was offered to Finn. Finn was offered to leave the world, to escape it. Fern roots himself in it permanently. And finally, Finn himself, pretty strongly implied to be reincarnated as Sherm. If not in the literal sense, at least in spirit, Shermie is very Finn-like. And in spirit is the only way reincarnation... that's how reincarnation works. It's in spirit. So that's what gets us this ending. Because the ending is, and has always been, come along with me. It's been an invitation to join in with something. To join in specifically with an adventure. And the series ends with its own title card with new characters. It ends with Shermie drawing that sword. 2, I noted a musical reference to the Zelda games, which there were some of those early on in the show too, and probably throughout, but I distinctly remember early on in the show there were some. And that's kind of the closing of the loop. Shermie and Beth have much the same relationship Finn and Jake did at the beginning of the series. Beth is calmer, more laid back, more mature. Shermie is a little bit hyper. He's thin as he was at the beginning of the series, getting his first sword. And it is the Finn sword. And that's the thing, is the series ends just as every episode ended with an invitation to come along on the adventure. Because the adventure doesn't end. That's the thing, is it could very easily read as bleak. I don't see any reason to think that the future landscape actually is post-apocalyptic, so much as just far in the future, so there's ruins. But still, there's this sense of nothing gets better. The same mistakes get repeated, and that could be very depressing. But instead, the show flips it around. It flips it around into that time adventure song, into saying that, these things are eternal. Friendship and adventure and all these things, like, they can go on forever because they survive. Disaster after disaster, the sweep of time, the length of history. 1,000 years from now, Sweet Pea will be wandering the world, still being a hero who fights using dark power. Because that's the Night Sword on his back in the brief shot we see of him. 1,000 years in the future, Lemon Hope is still out there. 1,000 years in the future, Jake's descendant and Finn's reincarnation are off having adventures with the Finn sword, and they know Beano. And there's no reason to think that Bubblegum and Marceline, they could be out there too. Simon at the end of the series is still wandering, still searching to get Betty back. He's not immoral, but there's still space, there's still time for him to have that adventure. Because the invitation still stands. There's still adventures to be had, and still we are invited to come along. Because this is adventure time, and the fun will never end. We'll always be back then. Growing up isn't so much moving in a line and leaving your old selves behind you. It's adding layers on top. And the child you were is always there. You can still play. You can still have those adventures. The fun really will never end. I think that's about it. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Check out my Patreon for early access to vlogs, let's plays, essays, and more. And I'll see you all next time. Bye!